They squirted Heinz ketchup on the shy food truck attendant for amusement, their raucous laughter drowning out her quiet gasp as the red sauce splattered across her pristine white apron. The three executives from Maxwell Enterprises didn't spare her a second glance as they walked away. Amelia stood frozen, the humiliation burning like acid while customers averted their eyes, pretending not to notice the spectacle unfolding before them. The ketchup dripped slowly down her uniform, each droplet marking the seconds that stretched into an eternity of shame. What the suited men couldn't know was that her husband of just 6 months, Julian Cordova, wasn't simply the quiet accountant they might imagine. Behind his unassuming demeanor and wire-rimmed glasses lay the carefully concealed heir to the Cordova empire. Julian had spent 3 years building legitimate businesses, alongside his family's more traditional enterprises, crafting a new image while never forgetting the principles that had sustained his family for generations. Loyalty, respect, and consequences. These weren't just words. When Amelia called him that evening, her voice still trembling as she recounted the incident, Julian simply listened, his silence more terrifying than any outburst of rage. The calm in his voice when he finally spoke sent chills down her spine. The executives, Richard Thornton, Wesley Parker, and Jonathan Grant, were celebrating their successful acquisition of Riverside Development, unaware that the transaction had already caught Julian's attention weeks earlier. Their celebration would be short-lived. The red ketchup staining Amelia's apron would soon become symbolic, a marker of how quickly fortunes could change when the wrong people were disrespected. Julian made a single phone call that night, his words few but precise. Within hours, a sophisticated network of information gatherers began compiling comprehensive dossiers on each man, their businesses, habits, weaknesses, and most importantly, the precarious financial positions they had carefully hidden from public view. Amelia watched her husband work with quiet efficiency over breakfast the next morning, his laptop open to spreadsheets that detailed not quarterly projections, but the methodical dismantling of 3 men's careers. She had never fully understood this side of him. 7 days, Julian said, closing his laptop as he kissed her goodbye. In 7 days, they'll understand what it means to disrespect someone without knowing who they are. His smile was gentle, contradicting the ice in his eyes. By noon, the first tremors of what would become an earthquake had begun, subtle but unmistakable to those who knew where to look. A planned financing arrangement for Maxwell's newest project mysteriously fell through, the bank citing unforeseen regulatory concerns. Richard Thornton dismissed the setback as a minor inconvenience during the executive lunch meeting, assuring his colleagues that alternate funding was merely a phone call away. The confidence in his voice masked the first tendrils of worry. What none of them realized was that Julian had spent years cultivating relationships with the city's financial institutions, his legitimate business acumen earning him respect, while his family connections opened doors that remained firmly closed to others. These resources were now being mobilized. By evening, all 3 men received identical text messages from unknown numbers, simply a photo of Amelia standing at her food truck, ketchup staining her uniform, their own laughing faces clearly visible in the background. No threat, no words, just evidence. Wesley Parker deleted the message immediately, dismissing it as a poor attempt at intimidation from some bleeding heart witness to their harmless prank. He couldn't know that Julian preferred subtlety to threats, allowing fear to build naturally. Julian Cordova had learned patience from his father, who had transformed their family from street-level operators to sophisticated businessmen over the course of 3 decades. Power isn't about who shouts loudest, his father had taught him. On the second day, the Maxwell executives discovered that their personal credit cards had been mysteriously flagged for suspicious activity, freezing their accounts during routine transactions. Small inconveniences, strategically placed to create the first cracks in their confidence. Wesley Parker found himself unable to pay for dinner with an important client, his stammered explanations about technical errors falling flat as the maitre d' discreetly suggested he might want to try another restaurant in the future. The subtle shift in respect was palpable. Jonathan Grant discovered his reservation at the prestigious Hamilton Club had been canceled, the membership director apologetically explaining that there seemed to be questions about his financial standing that needed resolution. The club had been his sanctuary for networking. Richard Thornton faced the most public embarrassment when his vehicle was repossessed from the valet parking at his daughter's private school gala. Witnesses described how he shouted at the repo men while parents and faculty watched with poorly concealed interest. Julian monitored these developments from his downtown office, the legitimate face of his operations housed in a gleaming skyscraper, that represented years of careful investment and planning. His assistant knew not to disturb him as he made a series of brief calls. Amelia had returned to work at her food truck, her chin held high, despite her lingering embarrassment, unaware that Julian had positioned two of his most trusted people nearby. Her safety was non-negotiable in his world of calculated risks. The relationship between Julian and Amelia had begun 2 years earlier, a chance meeting when he had stopped for lunch at her newly opened food truck. He had been drawn to her quiet dignity and determination, finding in her a refreshing authenticity. Julian had kept his true nature hidden from Amelia during their courtship, revealing his family connections only after he was certain of her character. Her response, concern not for his business but for his safety, had confirmed what he already knew. Their wedding had been small but elegant, attended by family and a carefully selected group of friends who understood the significance of Julian choosing a partner from outside their circle. His father had approved with a rare smile of recognition. At home that evening, Julian prepared dinner while Amelia described her day, deliberately avoiding mention of whether the Maxwell executives had returned. He already knew they hadn't. His sources had confirmed they were too busy with their multiplying problems. "I've been thinking about expanding the business," Amelia said, changing the subject to something that brightened her expression. "Maybe a second truck, or even a small restaurant location." Julian nodded encouragingly, making a mental note. The countdown to complete resolution had begun in Julian's mind, each element precisely timed to build upon the previous, creating a crescendo of consequences that would leave no doubt about the message being delivered. Respect wasn't optional in his world. By midnight, Julian had arranged for rumors to begin circulating in the business community about Maxwell Enterprises facing potential regulatory scrutiny, the whispers strategically placed to reach nervous investors without revealing their source. Wesley Parker checked his company's stock price obsessively before bed, noting with growing alarm the unexplained 3-point drop in after-hours trading. Something was happening, but he couldn't identify what or who was behind it. The third day dawned with Richard Thornton discovering that the keynote speaking engagement he'd been scheduled to deliver at the Industry Leadership Conference had been mysteriously canceled. His professional reputation, carefully cultivated over decades, was showing its first visible cracks. Wesley Parker arrived at his office to find his executive assistant unusually tense, informing him that 3 major clients had called to postpone their quarterly review meetings without explanation. The calendar that had been packed solid now showed alarming gaps. Jonathan Grant's morning began with a call from his wife, her voice tight with controlled panic as she explained that their family's summer home was being audited for property tax discrepancies going back 7 years. The implications were potentially devastating. The 3 men convened an emergency meeting in Richard's office, the usual confidence notably absent as they compared notes on their suddenly precarious situations. "This isn't coincidence," Richard finally acknowledged, loosening his silk tie with visible discomfort. "The food truck girl," Wesley said suddenly, the memory of their thoughtless prank surfacing with new significance. "The photo message. That has to be connected." The other 2 stared at him, initial dismissal quickly replaced by dawning recognition. Julian spent the morning in meetings with the city's most prominent developer, negotiating terms for a waterfront project that would cement his legitimate business credentials. His phone remained silent. No need for direct involvement yet in what was unfolding elsewhere. Amelia served lunch to a line of customers that seemed unusually long, unaware that Julian had arranged for several influential food bloggers to discover her truck and post enthusiastic reviews overnight. Her success would grow alongside the executive's decline. By afternoon, the Maxwell executives had assigned their security team to locate information about the food truck and its owner, the investigation revealing only that Amelia's Authentic Eats was a registered business with clean permits. The owner's husband remained invisible in their search. Richard attempted to call in favors from his banking connections to address his suddenly frozen business line of credit, only to discover an uncomfortable hesitation from people who had previously been eager to accommodate his requests. The barrier was impenetrable. Wesley's attempt to arrange an emergency meeting with their largest investor was rebuffed by a secretary who would have jumped at his command just days earlier. Her explanation that her boss was unavailable for the foreseeable future lacked the expected deference. Jonathan's lawyer called with disturbing news that environmental inspectors had suddenly taken interest in a Maxwell development project, citing anonymous concerns about potential violations that would require a complete work stoppage until resolved. The timing couldn't be worse. The foundation of Maxwell Enterprises, which had appeared unshakable just 3 days earlier, was now showing stress fractures that threatened the entire structure. What the executives couldn't comprehend was the orchestrated nature of their troubles. Julian reviewed the day's developments with his most trusted advisor, a silver-haired man who had served his family for 30 years. "They're beginning to feel it," the older man observed. "But they still don't understand the why or the who." "They will," Julian replied, his voice carrying the quiet certainty of someone who had calculated every variable and contingency. Tomorrow we move to Phase 2. The pieces were aligned perfectly on his mental chessboard. As night fell across the city, 3 men lay awake in their luxury homes, reviewing their lives for enemies capable of such coordinated attacks, while Julian held Amelia close, her breathing steady in sleep, unaware of the justice being methodically delivered. Day 4 arrived with an unseasonable downpour that mirrored the darkening mood at Maxwell Enterprises headquarters, where the board had convened an emergency session to address the cascade of misfortunes. Questions were being raised about leadership competence that no one would have dared voice a week earlier. Richard's normally commanding presence had diminished noticeably, his designer suit hanging slightly looser on a frame that hadn't slept properly in 3 nights. The boardroom that had once felt like his personal kingdom now seemed filled with potential adversaries. Wesley's presentation of their financial position was interrupted by his assistant, who whispered urgently in his ear that their primary lender had just called an immediate review of their outstanding loans. The blood drained from his face as he excused himself. Jonathan attempted to salvage the meeting by focusing on future projections, but the words sounded hollow, even to his own ears, as the projected figures on the screen seemed increasingly disconnected from their rapidly deteriorating reality. Trust was evaporating by the hour. In his downtown office, Julian reviewed the financial statements that his contacts in the banking industry had quietly provided, noting with satisfaction the accelerating liquidity crisis that the Maxwell executives were desperately trying to conceal from their investors. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. Amelia's food truck was experiencing unprecedented success, with lines forming before opening and ingredients selling out by early afternoon. The sudden popularity puzzled her, until a customer mentioned the glowing feature in the city's most influential food blog. Julian had ensured the article emphasized Amelia's inspiring story, a young entrepreneur pursuing her passion despite facing disrespect and obstacles from entitled elites. Without naming Maxwell Enterprises, the narrative resonated with readers who shared it across social media platforms. At the exclusive Century Club, where the city's power brokers gathered to shape deals away from public scrutiny, conversations paused when Richard Thornton entered for his usual lunch meeting. The subtle shift from deferential nods to curious glances registered immediately in his experienced social radar. His lunch companion, a senior partner at the city's most prestigious law firm, was uncharacteristically direct. "There are whispers about Maxwell, Richard. Regulatory concerns, financial irregularities, ethical lapses." The words hung between them like a guillotine blade. In the Maxwell conference room, Wesley and Jonathan sat silently across from each other after the disastrous board meeting, both men finally giving voice to what they had been avoiding. "This isn't random," Wesley said, tapping his finger on the table with each word. "Someone is targeting us specifically, systematically," Jonathan agreed, his legal mind analyzing patterns that were becoming impossible to ignore. "The question is, who has both the motivation and the resources for something this comprehensive?" Their search for answers led them back to the food truck incident, with Wesley dispatching a private security team to conduct proper background checks on Amelia and any connections she might have. "No matter how unlikely, we need to explore every possibility." Julian received word of their investigation almost immediately through one of the security personnel on his payroll, a strategic asset he had placed within the firm that Maxwell routinely contracted. Information flowed in one direction only, toward Julian, never away from him. The time had come to allow them a glimpse of the larger picture. Not everything, just enough to intensify their fear. Julian made a call to his banker, authorizing the next phase with 5 simple words: proceed with the margin calls. By evening, all 3 executives received simultaneous notifications that the personal loans secured by their Maxwell stock holdings were being called due to market volatility and diminishing collateral value. The financial noose was tightening with mathematical precision. Dawn of the 5th day brought the news that Maxwell Enterprises stock had dropped 18% in pre-market trading, triggering circuit breakers and drawing unwanted attention from financial media, speculating about the cause of the sudden collapse. The foundation was now visibly crumbling. Richard arrived at his office to find an unmarked envelope on his desk, containing photographs of himself with a woman who was decidedly not his wife, taken at a hotel he had visited during a business trip 6 months earlier. The accompanying note read simply, "Tomorrow, Cipriani, 8 p.m. Wesley and Jonathan received similar envelopes, each containing evidence of indiscretions they had believed buried: Wesley's creative accounting on his tax returns, Jonathan's questionable pressure on a zoning official for a previous development. Each envelope contained the same dinner instruction. The three men gathered in Richard's office, doors locked and phones placed in a drawer to prevent any possibility of surveillance. "This is coordinated blackmail," Richard concluded, his voice hoarse with stress and lack of sleep. Jonathan, ever the analytical mind, shook his head slowly. "This isn't about money. Whoever's doing this hasn't made any demands except for this meeting." He tapped the dinner invitation with a manicured finger. "This is about something else." Julian spent the morning finalizing arrangements for the evening's revelation, selecting the private dining room at Cipriani with meticulous attention to detail. The setting needed to convey power without ostentation, authority without vulgarity. The stage was being set for the final act. Amelia noticed her husband's unusual focus as he prepared to leave for work, his normally warm demeanor replaced by a cold efficiency she had glimpsed only in fragments before. "Is everything all right?" she asked, genuine concern in her voice. Julian softened momentarily, touching her cheek with rare tenderness. "After tonight, everything will be better," he promised, knowing the time had come to reveal certain truths about his world that he had protected her from. "I'd like you to join me for dinner later." The trading day ended with Maxwell Enterprises stock down 27%, triggering margin calls for numerous investors and creating a cascade of selling that the financial press was now openly speculating might signal deeper problems within the company. The vultures were circling. Richard, Wesley, and Jonathan spent the afternoon in crisis meetings with their legal team, PR consultants, and remaining financial allies, desperately trying to construct a narrative that would explain the company's sudden troubles without revealing their complete ignorance of the cause. Nothing sounded convincing. As evening approached, the three executives arrived separately at Cipriani, each man noticeably diminished from their arrogant postures of just 5 days earlier. The maitre d' led them silently to a private dining room where Julian Cordova sat waiting, his posture relaxed but commanding. For a moment, none of the Maxwell executives recognized him. They had never paid attention to the unassuming man who occasionally attended the same business functions, or sat quietly in meetings as part of another firm's advisory team. Invisibility had been Julian's greatest asset. "Gentlemen," Julian greeted them with a slight nod, gesturing to the empty chairs. "Thank you for accepting my invitation." His voice was soft, but carried an unmistakable authority that made all three men comply without question. Recognition dawned in Wesley's eyes first. "You're connected to the food truck woman," he stated flatly, mental connections forming rapidly as he pieced together the elaborate puzzle that had been systematically destroying their lives. Julian's smile never reached his eyes as he confirmed, "Amelia is my wife." The simple statement hung in the air like a judge's verdict, heavy with implications that were only now becoming clear to the three men who had thoughtlessly humiliated her. The private dining room fell into silence as Julian allowed the revelation to settle, the three executives exchanging glances that communicated their shared realization of how severely they had miscalculated. Richard was the first to recover, his businessman's instinct surfacing. "What do you want?" he asked directly, hands spread on the table in a gesture that attempted to reclaim some control. "Name your price and we can end this unpleasantness." His voice carried the confidence of someone accustomed to solving problems with money. Julian allowed himself a small, controlled laugh that contained no humor. "If I wanted money, Mr. Thornton, I would simply have continued what I've started and purchased your company's assets at pennies on the dollar next week." He gestured to a waiter who appeared instantly with champagne. As the waiter poured, the door opened again, and Amelia entered, her simple elegance a stark contrast to the rumpled appearance of the three executives who had humiliated her. She took the seat beside Julian, her expression revealing nothing as she faced her tormentors. "5 days ago, you believed you could disrespect my wife without consequences, because you assumed she was insignificant, that she had no power or connections worth considering." Julian's voice remained conversational, but the steel beneath was unmistakable. Wesley shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing at Amelia with new understanding. "The ketchup incident, we didn't realize who she was connected to." His attempted apology sounded hollow even to his own ears, revealing the fundamental flaw in their thinking. "That's precisely the point," Julian replied, leaning forward slightly. You believed it was acceptable to humiliate someone you perceived as powerless, which revealed everything about your character. He sipped his champagne with deliberate calmness. Jonathan, the lawyer's analytical mind working despite his fear, ventured the question the others were thinking. How have you managed all this? The coordinated financial pressure, the information leaks, the regulatory issues. It would require extraordinary resources. Julian smiled without warmth. My family has spent generations building relationships throughout this city's institutions. Banking, real estate, government, media. He paused deliberately. What you call organized crime, I call an alternative governance structure. Richard blanched visibly as understanding dawned, his voice dropping to a whisper. Cordova. You're Antonio Cordova's son. The name carried weight in certain circles, a family rumored to control significant portions of the city's underground economy for 3 generations. Now we can have an honest conversation, Julian acknowledged, nodding slightly at Richard's recognition. I've demonstrated what happens when you earn my displeasure. Now I'll offer you a choice about what happens next. Amelia, who had remained silent until now, spoke with quiet dignity that commanded attention. The choice isn't about money or business. It's about respect, not just for me, but for everyone you encounter regardless of their perceived status or power. Julian outlined the terms with precision. Maxwell Enterprises would establish a foundation dedicated to supporting small businesses owned by immigrants and working-class entrepreneurs, funded with $20 million from the executive's personal accounts. The foundation would be named for Julian's mother. Additionally, the 3 men would personally volunteer monthly at a community center in the city's poorest district, working alongside the people they had previously viewed as beneath their notice. The arrangement would continue for 5 years, with Julian's associates monitoring compliance. In exchange, Julian concluded, I stop what I've started. Your company recovers, gradually, not immediately, as that would raise questions. Your personal indiscretions remain private. Your lives return to normal, albeit with a new perspective on how you conduct yourselves. The alternative remained unstated, but hung in the air between them. Continued systematic destruction of everything they had built, exposure of their secrets, and eventual financial ruin. The choice was clear, though none of them had anticipated being brought so low by a simple act of cruelty. The morning after the Cipriani meeting, the Maxwell executives gathered in Richard's office, faces drawn with the sobering reality of their situation. They had spent the night weighing Julian's offer against their dwindling alternatives, pride warring with self-preservation. We have no choice, Jonathan concluded, breaking the tense silence. We sign the agreement, establish the foundation, and do the community service. His legal mind had already calculated the optimal path forward from their severely weakened position. Richard's resistance crumbled last, his empire's vulnerability now undeniable as their stock continued its downward spiral, despite their best efforts to project confidence. To think this all started with a stupid prank with ketchup, he muttered, shaking his head at their catastrophic miscalculation. The financial press had begun publishing investigative pieces about Maxwell Enterprises, questioning the company's governance and highlighting past ethical controversies that had previously been buried through influential connections. The narrative was shifting from business setback to corporate scandal. Wesley discovered that morning that his country club membership had been quietly revoked, the board citing a suddenly enforced morality clause in their bylaws. The social exclusion stung more deeply than he had expected, his identity intertwined with the elite circles he had fought to enter. Richard's wife had moved temporarily to their daughter's apartment, her terse message explaining she needed space to consider our future, after receiving anonymous photos of his infidelity. The personal cost of his actions was mounting alongside the professional consequences. Jonathan faced his own domestic crisis, as his partner questioned their financial security, the carefully constructed facade of unshakable success having crumbled overnight. For the first time, he found himself unable to provide reassuring answers about their future. Julian monitored these developments with clinical detachment, neither celebrating nor intervening as the natural consequences of his actions continued to unfold. The pressure would ensure compliance with his terms, removing any temptation the executives might have to renege once immediate threats subsided. Amelia's food truck continued its surprising success, with local news featuring her in a segment about successful small businesses that were changing the city's culinary landscape. The reporter praised her authentic approach and humble dedication to quality, values diametrically opposed to what the Maxwell executives represented. At the signing ceremony for the new foundation, photographers captured the three Maxwell executives alongside Julian and Amelia. The contrast between their strained expressions and the Cordova's quiet confidence telling a story beyond the official press release about corporate social responsibility. The community where Amelia had grown up would benefit most from the foundation, with microloans and business development resources flowing to neighborhoods that investment had traditionally overlooked. Julian had designed the foundation's structure to ensure the money couldn't be diverted or mismanaged. Richard's first day of mandatory community service became unexpectedly public when a social media influencer recognized him serving food at the community center. The video of the formerly imperious executive awkwardly dishing out pasta went viral within hours. Initial comments mocked his obvious discomfort, but the narrative shifted when the community center director praised the new corporate volunteer program, unaware of the coercion behind it. What had begun as humiliation was transforming, unexpectedly, into positive publicity. The executives discovered, to their surprise, that Julian had structured the foundation in ways that actually benefited Maxwell's public image, the charitable initiative generating goodwill that began to counteract the company's recent negative press. The design revealed a strategic sophistication they had severely underestimated. An unexpected development emerged when several of Maxwell's competitors began inquiring about participating in the foundation's initiatives, mistaking the forced penance for innovative corporate social responsibility. The executives found themselves in the ironic position of being viewed as industry leaders in community engagement. Jonathan's teenage daughter, previously embarrassed by the public scandal, brought home a school assignment she had written about the foundation's impact, her perspective shifting from shame to cautious pride. The essay's conclusion about learning from mistakes pierced his carefully constructed emotional defenses. As the seventh day concluded, Maxwell's stock showed its first modest recovery, the bleeding stemmed by Julian's invisible hand just as he had promised. The executives had learned that in Julian's world, both punishment and mercy were administered with the same mathematical precision. A month into their new arrangement, the three executives found themselves sitting at a planning meeting for the foundation they had been forced to create, reviewing applications from neighborhood businesses seeking support. The paperwork before them told stories of struggle and ambition that would have been invisible to them 6 weeks earlier. Wesley picked up a proposal from a father-son landscaping business needing equipment to expand their services. "This one actually looks promising," he noted with genuine interest, surprising himself with the realization that he was evaluating the business on its merits rather than dismissing it. Jonathan had become the unexpected liaison with the city's zoning department, using his legal expertise to help small business owners navigate regulations that he now recognized had been designed to favor established corporations like Maxwell. The irony was not lost on him. Richard had struggled the most with their enforced humility, but even he had begun to change through weekly interactions with people who couldn't advance his career or enhance his status. The experience was reshaping his understanding of value and respect in ways no business school had taught. Julian had maintained his distance, monitoring compliance through associates who provided regular reports on the executive's activities. He neither micromanaged nor interfered, allowing the natural consequences of their actions and choices to unfold organically. The foundation's first success story came when a neighborhood bakery secured funding to purchase equipment that tripled their production capacity, creating 7 new jobs in a community with chronic unemployment. Local media coverage featured the grateful owner thanking the Maxwell executives by name. Wesley found himself unexpectedly moved by the woman's tears of gratitude, her story of perseverance resonating in ways he couldn't have imagined when he'd carelessly squirted ketchup on a food truck worker for amusement. The memory now filled him with genuine shame. Richard received an invitation to speak at a community college's business program, the audience filled with students whose backgrounds more closely resembled Amelia's than his own privileged upbringing. His carefully prepared remarks about entrepreneurship sounded hollow even to his own ears. After the lecture, a student approached with questions about accessing capital without family connections or collateral. Richard found himself offering practical advice drawn from his recent foundation work, rather than the platitudes he would have dispensed 6 weeks earlier. During a foundation committee meeting, an unexpected visitor arrived, the elderly mother of a successful grant recipient, who brought homemade pastries to thank them. The simple gesture of gratitude left Wesley speechless, confronting him with the real human impact behind their financial decisions. Maxwell's corporate culture had begun to shift subtly, with executives who had once competed ruthlessly now collaborating on community initiatives. Middle managers watched with curiosity as their formerly cutthroat leaders championed ethical business practices with unexpected conviction. Jonathan found himself mediating a dispute between a property developer and neighborhood activists, drawing on skills he'd previously used in corporate takeovers. The resolution he crafted protected community interests while still allowing sustainable development, earning respect from both sides. A local university invited the three executives to participate in a panel discussion about corporate responsibility, an invitation that would have been purely performative before, but now represented a chance to articulate the uncomfortable truths they were still processing. Their candor surprised the audience. Jonathan discovered during a foundation site visit that one of the applicants was a former paralegal from his firm who had left to start a legal services cooperative for immigrants. The woman's surprise at his involvement reflected his own realization of how compartmentalized his life had been. The Maxwell executives gathered for their quarterly review with Julian, the meeting held in Amelia's newly opened restaurant, a bright, welcoming space that had quickly become a neighborhood gathering spot. The location choice was clearly intentional, a reminder of where their journey had begun. Amelia greeted them with professional courtesy, no trace of resentment in her manner as she seated them at the best table. Her quiet dignity remained unchanged, but her circumstances had transformed. Success achieved through hard work rather than exploitation or shortcuts. Julian arrived last, his usual unassuming appearance belying the power they now knew he possessed. "Gentlemen," he acknowledged with a slight nod, "I've reviewed your activities with the Foundation and Community Center. Your compliance has been satisfactory." Richard, who had once dominated such meetings with his imposing presence, spoke with uncharacteristic humility. "The Foundation is actually doing good work. We've approved 15 microloans and provided mentorship to over 30 businesses." The pride in his voice was genuine. Julian studied him carefully before responding. "The question is whether you've learned the difference between compliance and understanding. Are you following instructions, or has something fundamental shifted in how you see the world and your place in it?" The question hung in the air between them, challenging the executives to examine motivations they had never before questioned. Wesley was the first to break the silence, his response stripped of the calculated charm that had once been his professional signature. "I started doing this because I had no choice," he admitted, gesturing to the restaurant around them. "But last week I helped a woman secure funding for her tailoring business, and when she succeeded," he paused, struggling with unfamiliar vulnerability. "It felt better than any deal I've ever closed." Jonathan nodded in reluctant agreement. "I've spent my career manipulating regulations to benefit people who already had every advantage, using those same skills to help people navigate barriers." He shook his head slightly. "It's more satisfying than I expected." Richard remained silent longest, his transformation having been the most profound. "I always thought power came from making people fear you," he finally said, meeting Julian's gaze directly. "I'm beginning to understand there's another kind of power in earning genuine respect." Julian allowed a small smile to acknowledge their honesty. "The Foundation was meant as a punishment, but it doesn't need to remain one. The structure exists now. What you build with it is up to you." The subtle shift from coercion to choice was his final move in their long game. Amelia joined them, sliding into the chair beside Julian with the quiet confidence of an equal partner. "The restaurant just received a grant to train young people from the neighborhood," she announced, her success a living testament to what opportunity could achieve when not blocked by arrogance. The executives exchanged glances, the unspoken acknowledgement passing between them that their forced community service had revealed worlds they had chosen not to see throughout their privileged careers. The revelation was uncomfortable but impossible to unknow. "We have a proposal," Richard said finally, pulling a document from his briefcase. "We want to expand the Foundation's scope beyond the initial agreement. More funding, more neighborhoods, more types of businesses." His tone carried none of his former condescension. Julian accepted the proposal without opening it, his expression revealing nothing. "Your obligation was for 5 years. This extension would be voluntary. No coercion, no threats hanging over you." He studied each man carefully, reading intentions beyond their words. Wesley leaned forward, his designer suit no longer fitting quite right after weeks of community service had trimmed his formerly indulgent lifestyle. "We've realized that our business model itself needs revision. Maxwell has resources that could be deployed more ethically." Jonathan outlined their plan to establish a corporate policy requiring executive community service across all levels of management, not as punishment, but as perspective. Our executives need to understand the communities where we build, not just the profit margins. Richard, once the most arrogant of the three, spoke with newfound humility. We'd like your guidance, both of you. He included Amelia in his glance. Not because we're afraid of you anymore, but because you understand things about community impact that we're just beginning to learn. Amelia exchanged a look with Julian, their unspoken communication reflecting years of partnership. My food truck was never about becoming wealthy, she said. It was about creating something meaningful that served people with respect, regardless of who they were. Julian considered the executives thoughtfully, measuring the authenticity of their transformation. Genuine change requires more than temporary discomfort or fear of consequences. It requires a fundamental shift in how you value human dignity, including for those who can't benefit you. Maxwell's latest board meeting had featured an unprecedented agenda item, a systematic review of how their developments affected neighborhood accessibility and affordability. Several lucrative projects were voluntarily redesigned at significant cost to preserve community spaces and local businesses. Amelia's culinary training program had graduated its first class of students, creating a ripple effect as these young people secured positions throughout the city's restaurant scene. The graduation ceremony drew coverage from national media, interested in the unlikely partnership between a food truck entrepreneur and corporate executives. Richard had quietly begun mentoring the son of a community center custodian, recognizing in the young man's ambition echoes of his own early drive, but without the advantages he'd taken for granted. Their weekly meetings became a highlight that he prioritized over board dinners. The city's annual business awards had created a new category for community impact, with the unusual collaboration between the Maxwell executives and the Cordovas receiving the inaugural honor. The acceptance speech, delivered jointly by Richard and Amelia, emphasized dignity and respect as non-negotiable business values. The three men nodded, understanding the implicit test in his words. The foundation had begun as their punishment, but had evolved into something none of them had anticipated, a vehicle for genuine redemption and a more meaningful definition of success than quarterly profits. The meeting concluded with handshakes that carried none of the power dynamics of their previous encounters. As the executives departed, Julian and Amelia remained at the table, watching through the restaurant window as Richard paused to help an elderly neighbor with her grocery bags. A small, unprompted gesture that would have been unthinkable weeks before. Thank you all for following this story. If you enjoyed it, please write in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share the video, as your support is important for me to continue creating content here.